Hello, everyone. This is probably going to be my last talk about the COVID-19 crisis. Today, I would like to share with you my conclusions, basically a summary of my conclusions from the analysis that I made on this pandemic. So I summarized my conclusions in a few slides, which I will show to you. So I will again share my screen. Okay, there we go. So summary, key lessons learned and conclusions from my analysis on the COVID-19 crisis. So the summary of my conclusions is as follows. And I would like, first of all, to say that a number of these conclusions can be immediately drawn from the lecture that I posted this morning on my website, and which basically explains that high infection rates in the population always lead to an erosion of the natural immunity in people that are naturally protected against the disease. And because of this erosion of the natural immunity in naturally protected people, it will lead, so this high infectious rate will lead to an enhanced rate of disease and even severe disease. So that is something important to realize. To explain this relationship, I would like to refer you to the lecture I posted this morning on the occurrence of asymptomatic infection caused by COVID-19 or by SARS-CoV-2 virus. So the other important thing to realize is that on the other side, on the contrary, low infection rates in the population will lead to a breeding of more infectious variants. How this works is also explained in the lecture that I posted this morning. So for those who are less interested in the scientific arguments behind these conclusions, and I will read them for you, it will suffice to see and to follow what is going to occur, what is going to happen in the next weeks in several different countries where currently the COVID-19 crisis is still going on, and in some countries even intensifying. So what are the conclusions? Well, first of all, asymptomatic carriers, they will inevitably serve as a breeding ground for more infectious variants. So SARS-CoV-2 ensures its perpetuation in the population by infecting people to some extent in a non-symptomatic way. These asymptomatically infected people will be able to shed virus, and this will ultimately lead, as explained in the lecture I posted this morning, will ultimately lead to more infectious variants. So a second conclusion is that mass implementation of stringent infection prevention measures will enhance breeding of more infectious variants and hence pose a higher threat to younger age groups or otherwise naturally protected subjects. So that what I was saying, the higher the infection rate in the population, and of course, if you have more infectious variants, the infection rate in the population will go up. This will always lead to an erosion of the natural immunity mediated by natural antibodies in people that are naturally protected. So these are, for example, young people, naturally protected people, or people who at the beginning of the pandemic are naturally protected because they have sufficient natural immunity. So by implementing stringent infection prevention measures, you will just enhance the breeding of more infectious variants. And that's what we have been seeing at the end of last year, where all of a sudden, after almost 10 months of implementation of stringent infection prevention measures, we saw all of a sudden more infectious variants popping up. So third conclusion, mass vaccination campaigns will promote further breeding of variants that become even more infectious and will finally evolve into vaccine-resistant variants. Again, how this comes is explained in the lecture I put on the website this morning. And because mass vaccination campaigns will promote this further breeding of even more infectious variants, this will lead in, so mass vaccination campaigns in elderly or otherwise vulnerable groups pose a higher threat to younger age groups or otherwise naturally protected subjects. And that is precisely because the vaccination of this population will lead to a further breeding of infectious variants that were already circulating in the population before the mass vaccination campaign started. And the mass vaccination will just promote further breeding of these variants so that they become even more infectious and therefore become a higher threat to the younger age groups or other groups that are naturally protected. Mass vaccination campaigns in elderly followed by mass vaccination of younger age groups pose an even higher threat to these groups, so to the younger age groups. And that is due to the fact that first of all, as I was just saying, mass vaccination campaigns in the elderly will make the already circulating infectious, highly infectious variants even more infectious. So the infection pressure in the population will still increase. And on top, by vaccinating the younger age groups, this will lead, of course, to a suppression of natural antibody-mediated protection. So the antibodies that are generated in the younger age groups, they will increasingly prevent natural antibodies from neutralizing the virus, from capturing the virus. And so the combination of both the erosion of the natural immunity combined with a higher infection rate in the population due to mass vaccination campaigns in the elderly will ultimately pose a very high threat to the younger age groups. The next conclusion, mass vaccination dramatically diminishes the effect of infection prevention measures. So the more you vaccinate, the more you progress with the mass vaccination, the less the effect will be of infection prevention measures. Of course, except when if you do a complete lockdown and the virus can, so to say, no longer propagate at all. But otherwise, semi-lockdowns or just tightening up of infection prevention measures will have very, very, very little effect on the effect of the mass vaccination. Okay, then vaccine resistance in elderly or otherwise vulnerable groups. So I mean the resistance of the virus to the vaccine will of course pose a threat to those groups themselves, but will also pose a threat to the non-vaccinated people. And that is again, because if people become resistant to the vaccine, then they will be able to support the replication, the propagation of the virus. This will indeed lead to an increase in the infection pressure in the population and therefore erode the natural immunity of the non-vaccinated people, which will then in turn enhance the morbidity and mortality rate in those groups. So the next slide is my conclusion that there is no proof of any beneficial effect of the COVID-19 mass vaccination campaigns at the level of the population. We do know, of course, that there is an individual effect, or there is an effect at the individual level, which I think is going to be transient. And as already seen, there is increasing evidence that the protection even against severe disease is diminishing. So, but despite proven efficacy and safety in clinical trials, no doubt about this, of course. And when I talk about, well, safety in clinical trials, of course, we can only, or investigators could only evaluate this over the course and the duration of those clinical studies. If we are now seeing additional secondary effects or safety issues, well, this is of course due to the fact that many more people are now receiving these vaccines, and the period of follow-up is just being extended. But in principle, yes, those vaccines have been proven efficacious and safe in the clinical trials. But despite that, there is no single indication that these vaccines protect the population when used in mass vaccination campaigns during a pandemic. And I would even say, on the contrary, mass vaccination enhances erosion of the natural part of herd immunity while preventing its replacement by adaptive immunity. So since we are implementing this mass vaccination, we are, for example, seeing a dramatic increase in the number of infectious or highly infectious variants in many countries that are now vaccinating full speed and have brought their vaccination rates up to fairly high levels already. And on top, not only that, we are on top also witnessing very strong, very heavy waves of morbidity and also mortality in those countries. So there is, and I will come back, of course, to the case, a typical case of Israel and UK, where people are saying, well, you see that mass vaccination does have an effect. I explained previously, and I will show you again, that what we are seeing right now in those countries has nothing to do with the success of mass vaccination campaigns. So more and more conventional vaccines are being developed. So, I mean, if people were so convinced that these are the vaccines to use, then one is wondering, of course, why there are so many different other vaccines that are being developed, and not only variations on the S protein, with variations on the S protein, but also several different concepts. Well, when I look at these vaccines, I still consider them as being conventional vaccines, in the sense that they do nothing else than mimicking the immune response that is induced by natural infection, at least as far as the S protein is concerned, and that they have no sterilizing, they do not induce a sterilizing immunity. So it is my conviction that none of these vaccines will be able to control the more infectious variants, nor to generate adaptive herd immunity, which was proposed to be the end game of the mass vaccination. So if now there is a discussion that people are saying, well, in those countries that are vaccinating really like hell, and where there is no improvement in the rates of infection and disease, on the contrary, of course, it's easy to say, yeah, it's because we have not vaccinated sufficient people. We need to continue this mass vaccination campaigns, and to increase the vaccination rates before we will ultimately see an effect. So what I'm saying is that mass vaccinations do nothing else than, first of all, promoting the generation of more infectious variants, and second, also increasing or enhancing waves of mortality and morbidity in people who were naturally protected by virtue of a strong natural immunity. And that is because the two are related, of course. More infectious variants increase the infection rate in the population. And as I'm always saying, this infection rate is ultimately going to erode the innate immunity in people who were naturally protected, especially young people, but also people who are in good health, in good shape, and dispose of high levels of natural antibodies. So in order to sort out this eternal question or discussion, I've been asking for defining objective criteria that could be considered as reliable indicators of enhanced fitness of more infectious immune escape variants. So if we could agree, okay, tell us what are the indicators that clearly point to an enhanced fitness of these more infectious immune escape variants. And if we have this criterion, then we could, of course, ask the next question, which is very important. How do we now investigate whether or not there is a true correlation between these criteria and the external influences that we are applying to this pandemic? So the external influences such as those brought about by pharmaceutical or non-pharmaceutical intervention. This is to say mass vaccination or stringent infection prevention measures. So my fear is, and that is what I see coming, unfortunately, is that the health authorities will only admit the disaster of the mass vaccination when there is complete resistance to the vaccine, and when this complete resistance to the vaccine will result in huge morbidity and mortality rates, not only in the vaccinees, because the vaccinees, of course, if there is resistance, their antibodies will no longer work, and what they still will do is to suppress the natural immunity of these people. And because then the infection pressure will tremendously increase, even the non-vaccinated people will be threatened and will be subject to enhanced disease. And my fear is that it's only when we are going to see this happen, and that is what I predict, unfortunately, will happen, that authorities will admit that something went wrong. So, well, let me quickly show these curves. I've been showing them on previous occasions, but it's always good to repeat. Here you can see, for example, how countries like India had a second wave that was, well, it's not very close to the first wave, but when we compare this with what happened in our countries, the second or the more pronounced wave that we saw, and that was also including younger subjects, came pretty late. So there was, in terms of time, several months between the first wave and the more important waves that were also including younger subjects. So in India, for example, we see that this wave, despite the low infection pressure and this plateau here, is increasing pretty steeply, and it's also following pretty closely, just a few months, half a year maximum, less of course, let's say 4 months after the first wave ended. I think it's very, very likely that, in fact, mass vaccination, which was enhancing the development of more infectious variants, is contributing to the steep increase in the disease rate in India. As I was saying, higher infection rates, you get higher infection rates when more infectious variants are circulating, or when you're generating more infectious variants, and that is precisely what I think mass vaccination is doing. So it's not surprising then that due to this high infection pressure, you all of a sudden get a very substantial erosion of innate immunity in people who were previously protected and are now part of this important wave of disease seen in India. In other countries, for example, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, again, you saw this very steep increase in the second wave, even before the previous wave came to an end. Normally, the wave comes to an end, you go down, you come to a plateau, and then you can see a second peak. But of course, if you now have mass vaccination, which started here approximately, and the mass vaccination is again contributing to enhance infectiousness of a strain that was already highly infectious, namely the Brazil strain that is circulating in these countries. When on top you are whipping up the infectiousness of this strain by doing the mass vaccination, then it's no surprise that the second wave will almost immediately, a second wave of disease, also including younger people, will occur even before the previous wave has come down. So, and then what about these countries, you know, where you have the success stories, like, for example, in the United Kingdom, in Israel, and, well, was also hoped for in the United States, but of course in the United States, the slopes are again increasing. And, but let's look at the case of the United Kingdom and Israel. Here, this was claimed to be a success of the vaccine, this sharp decrease, which is not at all the case, because here we started the mass vaccination at the very peak of the infection. And we know if you have this peak of infection, then this really reflects the high susceptibility, the high vulnerability of people who got, as a result of the previous wave, who got their natural antibodies suppressed by suboptimal anti-spike antibodies that resulted from previous infection, so in asymptomatically infected people. And when you have these people who now get, of course, the disease, etc., they will develop antibodies, they will get protected. And then the remainder of these asymptomatically infected people, they still have antibodies that are high enough natural antibodies to prevent, in fact, the virus from spreading at high speed. Why? Because the virus is now circulating in that population, but asymptomatically infected subjects will only spread, will spread less virus. And also the amount of these asymptomatically infected people, after a vast or a large part of them have already been infected and got the disease here, the remainder comprises a smaller part of the population. They spread the virus pretty slowly, and hence the infection rate goes down. This has, in fact, nothing to do with the mass vaccination. For example, here in the UK, you got within a few weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, a drop of 50%. Whereas at that point in time, the vaccination rate was barely between 2 and 10%. So much, much lower than, for example, vaccination rates that were in Chile associated with a very strong increase, in fact, in the rates of infection and disease. So when this happened here in Chile, well, we had already vaccination rates around 40%. So there is no way to say that this is due to the vaccination. And this leaves, of course, people with a very false impression that in those countries you got a success story, because the decrease was simply due to the fact that the mass vaccination was started at the very peak height of the pandemic. And then, of course, you get this kind of plateau, as I was saying, where the infection rate is low, but which simply reflects breeding of even more infectious variants due also to the mass vaccination. You have the infectious strains already circulating. Mass vaccination will even further enhance the infectiousness of those variants. And it will evolve up to a point where you have resistance. And then you will see in those countries like the United Kingdom, like Israel, that all of a sudden you have a steep increase in cases. Okay, so what is the bottom line? So the mantra of vaccination that the more people you vaccinate, the less viral replication you have, and hence the fewer more infectious variants you will have. This does not apply at all. Please forget about this mantra. It is so wrong. Why? Well, it does not take into account the most fundamental mechanism of evolutionary biology, which is natural selection. And natural selection is often described as survival of the fittest. So the strains that are, or the variants that are most fit, that are the fittest, they will be selected and they will have an advantage, a competitive advantage. So this natural selection, in other words, is promoting the survival and the propagation of a highly infectious variants, which indirectly, as I explained, cause enhanced morbidity and mortality in previously naturally protected subjects. So this mantra doesn't apply because infectivity is going to go up dramatically because you are selecting and adapting highly infectious variants, even more so when you vaccinate. And those will be the cause of enhanced morbidity and mortality, especially in people who see their natural immunity eroded. And these are particularly people who were naturally protected at the beginning of the pandemic. So I've been calling, I've been asking, I've been begging to stop mass vaccination. This was my first call to the WHO. I would add to this, please, especially in youngsters, because this is going to be really a catastrophe. Not only will mass vaccination driving the generation of even more infectious variants that have already a very detrimental impact on the younger population because it erodes their natural immunity. But on top, by vaccinating them, these youngsters, you will of course generate long-lived antibodies that will suppress their natural immunity. And of course, when resistance, full resistance will come to the vaccine, then these youngsters are left with nothing at all. So their vaccinal antibodies will not work anymore, but they will also see their innate immunity suppressed for a long time due to these long-lived vaccinal antibodies. So I then, in a second call to the WHO, I asked to set up a task force concentrating on 3 items. First, eradicate the viral variants, because I see no other way to get rid of those. To focus on early treatment, that we can at least treat people at a very, very early stage of disease, avoiding for them to have to go to the hospital and to be put on mechanical ventilators. And the third topic for this task force I was asking for was to concentrate on health and natural immunity. So we know that good health, healthy lifestyle, healthy food, healthy living habits, etc., are correlated with good levels of natural antibodies. So good lifestyle, healthy life is very, very important. But again, no response either to the first call nor to the second call. Now, my last call is really to develop ASAP natural killer cell-based vaccine candidates. Why? Well, we know that in asymptomatically infected people, the virus can be completely eliminated at a very early stage of the disease by NK cells. And in fact, any kind of vaccine that would induce sterilizing immunity would do the job. But practically speaking, I see no other approach than an NK cell-based vaccine approach. So I have been offering my help on this. There has been no response either. Of course, against by fact checkers, I will be considered or labeled as as a vicious guy. This will be again one of my vicious traits, that I am advocating for NK cell-based vaccines to be developed. I sincerely think that this is really the best way to go, and without any personal benefit or profit or whatsoever, I can only say I'm willing to help collaborating on such vaccines. And it could even be that we don't know that other vertebrate species are infected as well. I don't know what is the situation like with our livestock, for example, where we have high concentrations of animals sitting on very small surfaces, like in the pig and poultry industry. And with all these variants appearing, with all these changes in the S protein, we know that also these changes in S protein are responsible for crossing species barriers. So I'm not so sure that none of these variants could be hosted by any of the livestock in our countries. So if that is the case, I mean, the vaccination may need to be extended to those animal species as well. And then I think it's also critical to develop as soon as possible reliable in-home serological kits so that people can self-test for anti-S antibodies. So basically speaking, if you have no anti-S antibodies, you can reasonably assume that your natural immunity is not eroded. And when on top you are in good health, well, you should have a reasonable good level of natural antibodies, not suppressed by any anti-S antibodies. If you're negative in such an assay, of course, the tests need to be reliable, because you cannot afford, of course, having false negative results. But if that is the case and your natural antibodies are not suppressed and you're in good health, well, basically you should be able to cope with any kind of infectious variant without having to suffer from severe disease. So why do we always need to learn everything the hard way? And I'm anticipating, because I've done a proper homework, and I fear that my conclusions will apply. You know, it's everyone will be able to check in the next coming weeks, but I herewith conclude my homework, and I think my messages have been very clear. And we will ask ourselves the question, well, why did we need to go through this pain, and why did we not learn things before, and we only learn when catastrophes happen? Well, I see a number of reasons. First of all, there is many unresolved questions with this, and I put a number of questions on my website, questions that have not been resolved, questions that have not been addressed, and it's always very, very dangerous to implement interventions on very large populations, to do large-scale interventions, for example, in terms of immunization, in terms of infection prevention, if you don't really understand what is going on, and if you cannot answer some basic and very, very important questions that cannot be answered by the simplistic mantra of conventional vaccination. I refer for those questions to my website, but I've just listed a few. For example, why you get all of a sudden, after this mass vaccination implementation, this fulminant increase in infectious variants, right? Why do we, so to say, have success in certain countries, whereas there is no success in other countries? I explained this to some extent, that there is a misinterpretation of the effect of the mass vaccination. Why today we can't predict curves anymore? If you hear the epidemiologists, well, they don't even know, they can no longer tell whether a curve will go up, down, up, or stay at the plateau. And so why all of a sudden we see, after some smaller initial waves, we see all of a sudden these big waves of disease, where also a number of young people are part of. And for example, yeah, how is the virus cleared in asymptomatically infected people? I mean, I am pretty much convinced that this is due to NK cells, but there has been no general consensus or even a debate on this. So this is the first thing. We leave many unresolved questions on the table. Second, we don't listen to insights of others. Nowadays, if you're not an officially recognized expert, or you don't have this kind of world reputation, or you are not a professor or you're not having a sufficient number of publications, well, people don't listen to you. And so it's not about really solving global health problems. It's more like focusing on people's bio, on people's track record. And I think it's not because you don't have all of these credentials that you don't have brains and that you cannot do a proper homework. So another reason why I think we always need to learn everything the hard way is that we are nowadays more focused on technologies than we are focused on fundamental principles of biology. Also, we think too much in silos. Everyone has his own field of specialty, of expertise, whereas solving complex problems like solving a global health problem, it requires a multidisciplinary approach. You have to draw from evolutionary biology, from immunology, from vaccinology, from virology, etc. We don't do that enough because we are too much focused on our silos. And I think our society is also increasingly developing what I call herd behavior or herd mentality rather than herd immunity, actually. And so what you can see is that, for example, the politicians are blindly following the key experts. And the key experts are blindly following the WHO. And the WHO is kind of like sticking to their global mandate. But as a result, people have no choice but to follow, in fact, the leaders of the pack. And what those are saying right now is, well, we call this in French, sois belle et tais-toi. So which means be nice, be beautiful, but shut up and just get yourself vaccinated. And that is certainly a situation, a mentality that is unacceptable. And we more and more live in a kind of society or climate right now where no other opinions seem to be tolerated, even if they are based on science. So I have been calling really for solidarity, but in return, I got a number of biologically naive fact checkers on my back. And these guys are pretty unscrupulous in that they blindly engage into politically orchestrated efforts to silence any opposition, even if that opposition is based on science. They are all about bashing and debunking and censoring websites, preventing dissemination of scientific information through several different media. So this is really a shame. And not only that, but also experts who have been criticizing me out of their ivory tower and hiding behind their name, their reputation, or their institution. Instead, of course, of engaging into a multidisciplinary discussion. I've often called to have this multidisciplinary discussion. It's easy to sit in your office and to talk to fact checkers and then give your opinion, and then the fact checkers, as the postman, they confront you with his opinions. I mean, that doesn't add anything, that has no value at all. So instead of solidarity, what we're seeing are coalitions that drive mass vaccination campaigns. Coalitions of people with conflicts of interest, be they political, commercial, or reputational interests, and all hiding behind each other. So I think this must stop, and I'm again asking colleagues and experts, not at least in my own country, to abandon this poor and hypocritical attitude and to collaborate on a constructive instead of a destructive way. So I think, and that is really what my forecast is, because I don't think this will have a happy end, and certainly not if we continue like this. I think it will even go to the point where the word vaccine, the term vaccine, will be banned from the medical vocabulary. We vaccinologists have paid a lot of attention and invested a lot of time and energy in convincing people of the usefulness and the benefit of vaccination. I think these efforts will be completely lost. We will never have that as many anti-vaxxers as we have already right now, and as we will certainly have at the end of the pandemic. So I propose to replace the term vaccine, which is referring to the conventional vaccines that we are using, to conditional immune protection inducing formulation. It's a long word, but the abbreviation would be CIPIV or CIPIV. But the word conditional is important. Why is this important? Because we need to learn that conventional vaccines can be very, very useful, but we can only use them in a beneficial way, provided certain conditions are fulfilled. So why am I saying this? Well, because the efficiency of conventional vaccines that are basically just mimicking immunity elicited by natural infection can only work provided indeed certain conditions are fulfilled. And I give you some examples. We have seen, for example, vaccination with live vectors against Ebola in people that were in the incubation time. So because there were contacts from cases and they were in a ring trial, they were vaccinated with a live vector, knowing that some of these people are in the incubation time. So this can lead to disastrous results. And now we have a new example that we use conventional vaccines for doing mass vaccination in the heat of a pandemic. And it is really a very, very bad idea because it's just making the whole situation much, much worse. So with that, I would like to thank, of course, all the people who have helped me and still help me in disseminating and getting out the word and getting out the scientific information to help disseminate this scientific message by ways of several different means. Some have used their broadcasting platforms, have made their broadcasting platforms available. And by doing so, we got our message disseminated by podcasts or even live stream shows. So I'm very grateful for the help of all these people. And we have avoided to use platforms that are specifically labeled as anti-vax platforms, because the message really is not against vaccination. It is really against vaccination under inadequate conditions, as I try to point out. I would like to specifically thank my nephew and my brother-in-law, who have been providing me on a completely voluntary basis with their unconditional logistic support, their trust, confidence, and dedication in the fight against this madness and in the battle to make science and justice prevail. So, in fact, after all this, I barely dare to look into your face, as I know that what I've been saying is incredibly bad news. And so there is always an option to not say anything at all. I could have just, have kept silent, and it would have made my life much easier. But knowing what I know and looking at what is currently happening in this world, and also knowing that there is still a very narrow window of opportunity for turning the tide, I felt like sharing this with you is simply a moral obligation. And last but not least, well, I'm not religious, but frankly speaking, I'm hoping for a miracle. And if God cannot do this, we as a human species need to make this happen. Thank you.